Music, why Jasmine Crockett says Rick Scott's IC immunity proposal could fall apart because of its own unintended effects, and how everyday citizens are now preserving evidence that his bill cannot erase. What she exposed about alleged ICE misconduct and the political effort to cover it up transformed an ordinary congressional hearing into a serious legal alarm. Rick Scott clearly did not anticipate before. We break down how Jasmine Crockett dismantled the core weaknesses of Rick Scott's ICE immunity legislation, while also explaining how accountability could still reach beyond federal protections. Make sure to hit subscribe. This story involves unlawful detentions, evidence collection, constitutional rights, and the moment when protecting law enforcement crossed into protecting wrongdoing. The Joint House Senate hearing on immigration enforcement had already been intense for hours. When Jasmine Crockett finally took the microphone, one witness after another described ICE actions that appeared to go far beyond tough enforcement and into far more troubling territory: U.S. citizens detained without justification, families separated based on appearance rather than legal status, entire communities living in fear. Regardless of whether they were documented or not, Republican lawmakers repeatedly argued these cases were rare mistakes, isolated incidents that didn't reflect any larger pattern. Democrats countered by introducing documentation and testimony suggesting these abuses were neither random nor uncommon. Then Crockett began speaking, and the entire direction of the hearing changed. She didn't open with charts, data, or partisan rhetoric. Instead, she made a calm but direct statement that instantly captured the room's attention. She said she wanted to address Senator Rick Scott's proposed bill that would grant ICE agents immunity from what he describes as lawfare, frivolous lawsuits meant to harass law enforcement. Crockett made it clear she had read the bill carefully, analyzed its wording, and believed the public needed to understand what it actually does not, what supporters claim it does. She raised a printed copy of the legislation, filled with highlights, notes, and color-coded tabs. At first glance, the bill sounds reasonable. Who wouldn't want to shield officers from baseless legal attacks? But Crockett stressed that once you read the actual language line by line, not just the public summary, serious concerns become impossible to ignore. The bill would give ICE agents broad civil immunity for actions taken during immigration enforcement activities. That may sound narrow until you realize how loosely immigration enforcement can be defined. Crockett flipped to a marked section and pointed out a critical issue. The bill does not require the action itself to be lawful. It does not require reasonable suspicion or probable cause. It does not exclude constitutional violations. Under this proposal, an ICE agent could unlawfully detain a U.S. citizen, violate Fourth Amendment protections, cause financial and emotional harm, and still face no civil liability simply because the act occurred under the label of enforcement. Crockett emphasized that this isn't protecting law enforcement. It creates government actors who operate above the law. Republican members quickly objected, claiming she was misrepresenting the bill's purpose. But Crockett wasn't finished. She then explained why the legislation wasn't just dangerous. It was ineffective. She pointed out something Senator Scott and his supporters appeared to overlook. Civil immunity does not block criminal prosecution. It does not prevent state-level charges. It does not stop local district attorneys or state attorneys general from pursuing cases when federal agents violate state laws. The bill merely closes one path to accountability while leaving several others wide open. She paused to let that reality settle in before delivering her final warning. When ICE agents illegally detain U.S. citizens, and documented cases prove this has already happened, and when those agents believe they're protected by Senator Scott's immunity shield, they may be stunned when state prosecutors step in with criminal charges for false imprisonment, crimes like kidnapping and civil rights. Violations under state statutes are not erased by federal immunity. Being shielded at the federal level does not mean an individual is protected from prosecution under state law. And based on what is already being documented during these enforcement operations, state prosecutors are paying close attention, and many will be eager to pursue cases Where laws have been broken, the room fell into near silence. What Crockett laid out was not a theoretical legal argument. It was a clear, practical path to accountability that Senator Scott's legislation appeared to completely overlook. Republican lawmakers leaned toward their legal aids, quietly trying to determine whether her interpretation of the law was correct. Democratic members, meanwhile, looked energized, recognizing that she had just explained how accountability could move around the federal immunity barrier, but Crockett wasn't focused on the procedural reactions unfolding around her. She turned her attention directly to the people most affected by the conduct she was describing. She spoke to anyone who had been unlawfully detained, anyone who had witnessed ICE operations, and anyone in possession of proof that agents violated the law. Her message was urgent and unmistakable. She urged them to preserve everything. Save documents. Keep photos and videos. Record dates, times, locations, agent names, badge numbers, vehicle markings, every detail possible. Because, she explained, Senator Scott's immunity proposal cannot erase evidence. And when prosecutors, whether federal, state, or local, eventually bring cases forward, that evidence will be essential. The transition from legal explanation to direct instruction was striking. Crockett was no longer debating policy with colleagues. She was actively empowering victims and witnesses, effectively organizing a public record that could withstand any legal protections Republicans attempted to construct. 1. Witness who had testified earlier, a U.S. citizen detained for 3 days despite providing proof of citizenship, was visibly emotional, nodding as Crockett spoke. Her words clearly resonated with those who had lived through the experiences she was describing. Then Crockett shifted again, moving beyond legal mechanics into historical and moral territory. Her tone sharpened and her language carried greater weight. She said what the country is witnessing is not simply strict immigration enforcement, but a climate of fear that mirrors some of the darkest chapters in American history. She referenced slave patrols that terrorized black communities for generations, explaining that they operated on a similar principle. Certain people were presumed to have fewer rights, allowing state agents to stop, question, and detain them based solely on appearance. The comparison was deliberate and immediately controversial. Republican members objected loudly, calling the comparison inflammatory and inaccurate. But Crockett did not retreat. She clarified that she was not claiming ICE and slave patrols were identical. She argued that the functional structure was comparable. When government agents are empowered to target people based on how they look, detain them without sufficient cause, and are granted legal immunity even when they violate the law, the core mechanics of a patrol system designed to control suspect populations are recreated. She reminded the room that history does not repeat itself exactly, but it often echoes. And those echoes, she warned, should deeply concern anyone committed to constitutional rights. Now visibly emotional, Crockett addressed the chamber again, her voice carrying beyond legal theory. She offered an apology on behalf of the United States government to every person unlawfully detained, every family separated without legal justification, and every community living in fear because of these operations. She said they deserved better, that the Constitution promises better, and that the government's failure to uphold those promises is a disgrace. The apology stunned the room. Members of Congress rarely apologize on behalf of the government during official hearings, and the moment left many visibly unsettled. It's often viewed as inappropriate and individual. Lawmakers speaking as if they represent the entire government. Many consider it crossing a line. But Crockett showed no concern for that expectation. She wasn't addressing process or political norms. She was speaking directly to those who had been harmed, openly acknowledging their suffering instead of hiding behind technical language or partisan positioning. In the gallery, the impact was immediate. Witnesses and family members affected by ICE operations were visibly emotional. Several people were openly crying. The moment was raw and impossible to ignore. Republican members attempted to regain control of the hearing, accusing Crockett of turning a serious oversight session into political theater. She pushed back by returning to the real-world consequences of Senator Rick Scott's proposal and explaining why it would ultimately fail to protect the very agents it was meant to defend. She explained that Senator Scott appears to believe he can pass legislation that simply erases accountability, but she argued that approach misunderstands human behavior and the law. When immunity is granted without requiring that actions be legal, it encourages misconduct. It sends a message to agents that consequences no longer apply. And when abuses become severe enough, when citizens are detained and constitutional rights are violated, you create conditions where public outrage overwhelms political protection. Even from allies, Crockett then laid out a scenario Scott's bill could not stop. An ICE agent detains a U.S. citizen, holds them for multiple days despite clear proof of citizenship, and causes serious harm in the process. Under Scott's bill, the victim may be blocked from filing a civil lawsuit. But that is not the end of the story. The state where the incident occurred can still file criminal charges for false imprisonment. A local district attorney can move forward with prosecution, and when those cases reach court, all preserved evidence, documents, videos, testimony, timelines becomes public. Scott's immunity provision does nothing to stop that. It simply redirects accountability through a different legal path. Her prediction was detailed and devastating, and she warned that the fallout would extend far beyond the courtroom. When criminal trials expose abuse in state courts, the political consequences for lawmakers who supported immunity become severe. They will be seen as having voted to protect agents later convicted of violating Americans' rights, an extremely difficult position to defend during re-election campaigns. She described it as a political time bomb. Grant immunity, encourage abuse, allow that abuse to be prosecuted at the state level, and then face public backlash for having shielded the perpetrators. It was a clear chain of events that Scott's legislation appeared not to anticipate, and Crockett made sure everyone understood how it would unfold. Later that day, during a follow-up interview on CNN, Crockett expanded on her arguments and added further clarity to her warnings. The host asked about her controversial comparison to slave patrols, giving her a chance to soften or retract the statement. She did neither. She said she meant exactly what she said. There are documented cases of U.S. citizens of Latino descent being detained because agents assumed their ethnicity meant questionable legal status. That, she explained, is racial profiling targeting people based solely on appearance. And when immunity is granted to agents engaging in that behavior, the government is effectively authorizing a patrol system designed to control specific populations. She made it clear this wasn't about partisan politics. It wasn't left versus right. It was about right versus wrong. The interviewer then pressed her on Senator Rick Scott's intentions, asking whether she believed he was deliberately enabling abuse or simply trying to protect agents doing difficult work. Crockett's response was sharp and uncompromising. She made it clear that Senator Scott's personal motivations were not her concern. What mattered, she said, was the actual effect of the legislation. And the effect of the bill, as written, is the creation of legal protection for unconstitutional behavior. Whether that outcome was intentional or the result of careless drafting was irrelevant to her. The language of the bill is unambiguous, and its consequences are easy to predict. When accountability is removed, misconduct increases. That pattern is well documented and not difficult to understand. She then delivered a warning that would quickly become the most widely circulated clip from the interview. Senator Scott and every lawmaker backing this immunity proposal, she said, need to accept a basic reality. You cannot pass a law that erases evidence. You cannot make witnesses forget what they observed or make victims forget what was done to them. Civil lawsuits can be restricted, but criminal prosecution cannot be legislated away. Federal immunity does not control the decisions of state prosecutors. She called the bill a temporary fix for a problem that requires real reform. And when that fix fails, as she insisted it will, those who supported it will be forced to explain why they chose immunity over accountability. Back in Washington, Senator Rick Scott's office was already managing the consequences of Crockett's public dismantling of his proposal. Sources familiar with internal discussions said his staff initially believed the bill would move quietly through Republican circles. Framed as protecting law enforcement from activist-driven lawsuits, it was expected to face minimal resistance. What they did not anticipate was a lawmaker with Crockett's legal expertise publicly explaining why the bill was ineffective and how it could ultimately expose agents to even greater risk. The legislative approach shifted almost immediately. A so-called clarifying amendment was drafted, attempting to soften the criticism by adding language about reasonable belief of legal authority and exceptions for constitutional violations. But by then, the narrative had already taken hold. Democratic lawmakers who might otherwise have avoided the issue now had a detailed framework for opposing the bill. Civil rights and civil liberties organizations redirected their attention, making the defeat of Scott's proposal a new priority. At the same time, state attorneys general, particularly in states with reform-minded prosecutors, began stating publicly that federal immunity would not stop them from pursuing state charges against federal agents who violated state law. Perhaps most impactful was Crockett's call for evidence preservation. Advocacy groups quickly responded, distributing guides on how to document ICE encounters, what details to record, and how to securely store evidence for future legal action. What emerged was a grassroots legal infrastructure, a decentralized system of documentation that no federal immunity statute could undo. An immigration law expert later explained to reporters that Crockett had identified the core flaw in Scott's strategy. Federal immunity from civil lawsuits does not block state-level criminal prosecution. That separation of authority is fundamental to the American system. States enforce their own laws through their own courts and prosecutors. A federal statute limiting civil liability does nothing to stop a state district attorney from filing criminal charges. The analyst compared Scott's bill to reinforcing only one side of a structure while leaving the remaining sides completely exposed. By redirecting accountability through state legal systems that are often more responsive to local voters, Crockett altered the entire political and legal equation. If agents believe they are protected only to face state criminal charges, the calculus changes immediately. For Jasmine Crockett, both the hearing and the interview reflected her broader strategy. She focuses on the real-world consequences of legislation, explains those consequences in clear terms the public can understand, and lays out concrete paths for resistance and accountability, making it harder for harmful policies to operate in the dark. She wasn't simply opposing Senator Scott's proposal. She was explaining exactly why it would collapse and what ordinary people could do to make sure it did. In a closing remark during the hearing that received little media attention but left a deep impression on those in the room, Crockett once again addressed the people most affected. She spoke directly to victims and witnesses. She told them they were the very thing those in power feared most. Their voices, their records, their courage to speak despite intimidation. She explained that real accountability depends on people refusing to stay silent. Senator Scott's bill, she said, is designed to convince them that speaking out is pointless, that even when abuse occurs, nothing will happen. She rejected that idea outright. She urged them to preserve evidence, document their experiences, and tell their stories. And she told them to pay attention to what happens when prosecutors who care about justice are given credible proof. Federal immunity, she reminded them, does not equal freedom from consequences. And agents who cross legal lines will soon discover that reality. What made her message so powerful was that it blended legal reasoning with empowerment. She wasn't offering false hope. She was explaining, step by step, how accountability still functions even when lawmakers try to shut certain doors. Evidence cannot be erased by statute. Testimony cannot be undone by political votes. And responsibility has a way of finding new paths when old ones are blocked. It was both a strategy and a promise, and it resonated because it came from someone who understood the law and the human damage caused by its misuse. Rick Scott's immunity bill would continue moving through Congress, gaining Republican backing, as a symbolic defense of immigration enforcement and alignment with Donald Trump's broader agenda. but it would now carry a label Crockett had permanently attached to it, legislation designed to shield abuse. Promoted by officials more concerned with protecting agents than protecting citizens' rights, and what not if. But when cases emerged of agents hiding behind that immunity after violating constitutional protections, every lawmaker who supported the bill would be forced to answer for it, for Scott in particular. Representing Florida, a state with a large and diverse Latino population, including millions of U.S. citizens, the political math was becoming increasingly difficult. Crockett had made it unmistakably clear that his bill would protect agents who detain citizens based on ethnic appearance. That stance is not easily defended in a state as diverse as Florida, and the pressure was already starting to show. The real question was never whether some version of the bill might pass. With Republican control, it likely would. The real question was what would happen afterward when the consequences Crockett warned about began unfolding. When state prosecutors started filing charges. When carefully preserved evidence entered courtrooms. When accountability arrived through channels federal immunity couldn't block. What Crockett delivered wasn't just analysis. It was a warning disguised as explanation. And for anyone paying close attention, it was also a blueprint showing exactly how accountability could move around federal protections and still reach those responsible. If this breakdown of how Jasmine Crockett exposed the fatal weaknesses in Rick Scott's ICE immunity bill and mobilized evidence preservation in the process helped you understand why legal expertise matters in political battles. Hit the like button and subscribe for more analysis. Leave a comment with your thoughts on whether state prosecutors should step in when federal immunity shields constitutional violations. And share this with anyone who needs to understand that accountability doesn't disappear because of legislation. It simply takes a different route. Your engagement helps keep attention on the constitutional fights that decide whose rights are protected and whose violations are finally held to account.